I'm going to take that and run with it right now in our interview as I turn to retired Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, now NBC News Chief International Analyst. Also with me, former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. Gentlemen, I'm glad you're both here. So, Admiral, you have the UN Secretary General who said, quote, neither the region nor the world can afford another war. After the events of last night, after hearing Raf's excellent reporting on that which has been discussed inside the Israeli War Cabinet, after hearing Andrea Mitchell's excellent reporting on that which was discussed within the United States leadership, tell me where you think things stand.
Let's start with the G7, representing a huge percentage of the world's gross domestic product. Typically, the United States kind of steers that group. Issuing a statement alongside the United Nations Secretary General. And clearly, the Biden administration would like to avoid, quite sensibly, a real regional war here. I think, therefore, there'll be a lot of pressure on Israel. I take Benny Gantz, who I know very well, worked with him directly for 4 years when I was NATO commander and in charge of U.S. Israeli military relationships. I take him at his word. I think there will be a response at a time and a place of Israeli choosing. Frankly, I'd look for cyber, covert, a continuation of kind of inside Iran options. I don't see a big a thunder and lightning storm like we saw last night. Final thought, Alex, pretty good day for those air defenders to knock down 300 drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Clearly, Iran telegraphed this. They were leaning forward to do so. But the fact that no big group of Israelis were killed, no damage on the ground, gives Israel some breathing space to make a decision here. I think we're in that breathing space portion now.
Yeah, and even to amplify what you just said, Raf Sanchez said they had updated in the Israeli War Cabinet meeting that it was actually more like 350 attempted strikes. So to your point, very successful on that front. However, Ben, when it comes to Israel's War Cabinet, they met this morning. They're portraying the Iran attack as a failure, probably largely because of what the Admiral's saying and how it wasn't something that really came to ruination of communities or attacks on people. But is there still surprise on the world stage that Iran was bold enough to attack Israel directly for the first time?
I think to some extent, and that probably was the main impulse for the Iranian attack. Look, there has been an ongoing war, essentially, between Israel and Iran for years through proxies or through attacks in third countries. And two things have happened in recent weeks that are different and unprecedented. You had the Israeli strike on the Iranian diplomatic facility in Syria that killed several senior members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Iran takes that as part of their sovereign territory because it's their facility in Syria. And so then Iran ratchets it up in response and does something unprecedented in launching from Iranian soil this kind of large-scale attack on Israel. I think part of what's interesting and what people are digesting, though, is that if Iran really wanted to escalate this into a wider war, they probably would have activated Hezbollah, their proxy in southern Lebanon, to fire some of the thousands of rockets that they have pointed at Israel. They probably wouldn't have telegraphed so much what they were doing. Sure, they wanted to hit Israel, make no mistake, and it's a testament to the air defenses and capabilities of both Israel and the United States that they weren't able to. But it seems like, they put out a statement from their UN representative saying, this is done as far as we're concerned. It seems like they would like to revert back to that kind of status quo where there's not direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran, but there's probably the ongoing proxy conflict across the region. So the decision that Israel has to make is, having received that signal from Iran, do they respond by hitting Iranian proxies? Do they respond in Syria? Do they respond in Lebanon? Do they respond? We've even seen them take strikes in Iraq. Or do they feel like they need to answer and hit Iranian territory? And that's the kind of thing that would ratchet things back up. As Admiral Stavridis said, what they might do is something more covert or something in the cyber domain inside of Iran, so it doesn't feel like a direct kinetic escalation. But the reality here is we're in this kind of tenuous moment where things can revert back to the already tenuous conflict between Iran and Israel across the region. Or Israel could make the decision to kind of take the next escalatory step by hitting things inside of Iran. Clearly, what the Biden administration wants is that not to happen.
But Ben, reverting is one thing, but when you take away the word unprecedented, this has happened. How concerned are you that this is now something that could be somewhat normalized? Iran attacking inside of Israel, Israel attacking inside of Iran potentially.
Yeah, this is a significant. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, but I want you both to answer. Ben, you first, and then you, Admiral.
Oh, yeah, I'm very concerned. And this is what we've seen since October 7th, right, is all kinds of things. You know, there's been an ongoing conflict in this region for years, but you've seen the risk tolerance go up. In Israel, obviously, the tolerance for the kind of level of destruction that we've seen inside of Gaza, but also the degree to which you've seen, you know, Iranian proxy forces attacking U.S. forces in the region much more aggressively than in the past for a while, until those U.S. airstrikes essentially knocked that back. But the Houthis' attacks on shipping, the Israeli attacks on a diplomatic facility, now the Iranian attacks into Israel. I think you're right. As long as the war is ongoing, and this is why, ultimately, unless there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we're just in this space, a very unsettling space. As long as that war is ongoing, I think the risks of escalation and the risks of unprecedented things happening and the risks of that continuing to creep in the direction of a kind of broader regional war, they remain.
Admiral, now your turn, sir. Just the prospect of unprecedented, no longer being unprecedented, and opening the door for some normalization of this kind of back and forth.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. Very concerning. On the other hand, because of all of the external pressures at play here, because the world knows if this goes regional, step one by the Iranians will be shut the Strait of Hormuz. There goes 25% of the world's oil, and dire consequences globally. Literally nobody wants that at this point. And certainly, again, not the Biden administration. So those are some speed breaks on what is a very dangerous situation. Final thought, because I didn't mention it earlier, Alex. Another kind of in-the-middle reaction by the Israelis might be to go after Iranian naval assets. Their spy ships that are operating in the Red Sea, that are giving the targeting information to the Houthis, their supply ships that are moving weapons to the Houthis. All that is a kind of in-the-middle target, different than jets whistling overhead Tehran, but still Iranian territory. Add that to the options list being considered alongside cyber, covert, and the things I mentioned earlier. Bottom line, it is a very precarious moment, and all of us globally ought to be counseling on both sides. And I would predict China, for example, might be saying to the Iranians, this is not the time for more, just as we are saying to the Israelis. Hopefully we'll get through this.
Ben, NSC spokesman John Kirby was asked about any back-channel communication with Iran before the attack, and take a listen to what he said.
I would just say we made it very clear to all parties, including Iran, what we would do and how we would continue to defend Israel, and also how seriously we would take any potential threat to our personnel and our facilities in the region.
Can you give us some more insight into how this kind of communication happens and how much of a role the U.S. could play in keeping the peace going forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, to be a bit more specific, then obviously John is going to conceal, private channels. But if you take the Obama years, for instance, I mean, at times we were in direct contact, obviously, with the Iranians because the negotiations around the nuclear deal. But when we weren't, there are third countries that you could use to pass a message to the Iranians. The Omanis often were a channel of communication to the Iranians. Turkey. And I think in this case, the U.S. is probably calling up everybody that has a line into the Iranians, including, as Admiral Stavridis suggested, China. and saying, look, now's the time to communicate to Iran to not ratchet this thing up, to ideally not take any action, but certainly not to try to seek a regional war. So I think you activate all those lines of communication. Some of them are probably more active than others. And I think part of the message that the U.S. is sending is like, look, we don't want to be involved in this directly. So number one, do not even think about hitting any of our forces or personnel in the region. Number two, we're going to provide air defense support to the Israelis. And then also we're going to evaluate what you do, and that's going to inform our own action going forward. But I think the U.S. is probably also signaling, look, we don't want to be involved in this. We don't want a direct conflict. That's all the more reason to not escalate this thing. And I'm sure those messages are being sent right now. I'm sure that those are ongoing channels of communication that the U.S. is utilizing.
Yeah, we know in this case the Swiss have played a very critical role for this. Admiral, the Biden administration is pushing Israel, don't retaliate. Does President Biden still have enough influence over the Israelis to rein in any potentially impulsive actions?
I think so, and start with the level of weapons systems, support, ammunition that we provide. There's been a lot of talk across the political spectrum of using that as leverage. In the case of reducing Israeli operations in Gaza, that's very real. And again, in my dealings with the Israelis, they're quite cognizant of how much of their materiel support comes from us. Number two, intelligence support. We get a lot of great intelligence from the Israelis. Believe me, they get a lot of great intelligence from us. That's a spigot that can be dialed down if necessary. And then third, and I think most importantly, there's simply the leverage of allies and partners going back to the founding of the State of Israel. We were the first nation to recognize Israel. We have always stood with Israel. There's a high degree of moral sway that goes into that as well. So I think all three of those are ways in which there's real leverage here. I suspect the president is applying it judiciously, but hopefully effectively to tamp all this down.
A very important conversation with you both, Admiral and Ben Rhodes. Guys, thank you so much. Appreciate it.